Hey guys, hope you're doing well today. This is part 5 in the Jesus is God According to Mark series. You don't have to see the first ones to understand this one, but you should check those out on your own time if you would like. If you haven't seen them already, I think there's some good stuff in there. But today we're going to have a quick video looking at something that Jesus says, where I think Jesus seems to be hinting at his divinity himself. And this is in Mark chapter 12, verses 35 through 37. So let's jump right into it. Mark 12, verses 35 through 37. While Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, "How can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David?" Speaking by the Holy Spirit, David himself declared, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." David himself calls him Lord, so how can he be David's son? And the large crowd listened to him with delight. For good measure, let's just read Psalm 110, verse 1, which is what Jesus just quoted. Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. First, I want to say what Jesus is not saying. He's not saying that the word Lord always refers to God. That would be a horrible argument. The word Lord could be used for anyone of a higher status or authority than yourself. And back then, things like age were a big deal. For example, you see Jacob calling his older brother his Lord, but you wouldn't expect to see Esau call his younger brother his Lord. So the point that Jesus is making is not that since the Messiah is called the Lord of David, that by definition that means he's the God of David, because the word Lord always refers to God. That's not his point at all. If you're wondering why when I quoted Jesus, I said the Lord said to my Lord, but when I quoted Psalm 110 directly, I said Yahweh says to my Lord, it's because if most of you probably already know this, but when the Old Testament uses the word Lord or the word God, and it's in all caps, it means it's actually being used as a placeholder for the personal name of God, Yahweh or Yahuwah, Yahovah, Jehovah, however you pronounce the name. So in the original Hebrew text, Psalm 110 actually reads, Yahweh said to my Lord. But by the time of the first century, they wouldn't have actually pronounced that name out loud. They would have usually replaced it out of reverence with the name Lord. So Jesus says, the Lord said to my Lord. But in Psalm 110, it would have actually read, Yahweh says to my Lord. But again, the point that Jesus is making here is not that the word Lord always refers to Yahweh, and therefore the Messiah must be God because he's called Lord. So what is Jesus trying to prove by quoting this passage? Well, I think there are a couple different ways that you could understand this. The more popular one is that you wouldn't expect David to refer to the Messiah as his Lord. Psalm 110 was a messianic psalm, meaning it's a psalm about the Messiah, and this is probably not disputed by the audience of Jesus. So when David says, Yahweh says to my Lord, that person that he's talking about is actually the Messiah. He's saying, Yahweh spoke to the Messiah, who is my Lord. So David is calling the Messiah his Lord, and you wouldn't expect David to say this, because it was also common knowledge in that day that the Messiah would be the son of David, meaning a descendant of David. Not the direct son necessarily, but a future descendant of David. Now remember I said age was a big deal in that culture. That's why you have Jacob calling his older brother Lord, but you wouldn't have Esau calling his younger brother Jacob his Lord. Likewise, you would never see a father calling his son his Lord, or a grandfather calling his grandson his Lord. And yet, David calls the Messiah, a descendant of David, his Lord. And that's why it would make sense for Jesus to ask the question, in what way is the Messiah the son of David, if even David calls him Lord? David would never call a descendant of his Lord if they were a mere human biological descendant. But if he's something more, then maybe David could call him Lord. And that's the point that Jesus seems to be trying to make. The Messiah must be something more than just a mere human descendant of David. Being a mere biological descendant of David, even being the Messiah, would not make him greater than David. At best, it would make him equal, but not greater. Some might object and say, surely the Messiah is a unique situation, and he of all people, the ultimate king of Israel, could be called the Lord of David. But I want to push back and say I don't think that would have been so obvious to the first century audience who would have known their Tanakh, their Old Testament, really well. Back then, every king of Israel who came after David was a biological descendant of his. The reason for this is because God made a special promise with David that it would be his throne that would be established forever, which is why everyone who came after David was said to be sitting on the throne of David. Consider what it says in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Here, God is speaking through Nathan, telling David, it will be your throne that will be established forever. So every king of Israel who came after David was actually sitting on the throne of David. The reason they had the special kingship was because God promised David's throne would remain forever. Consider, for example, what it says about Solomon, David's direct son, in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 23. Then Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh as king in place of David his father, and he prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. Notice Solomon is not usurping David's throne here. He is reigning in the place of David. Every king of Israel who comes after David gets their kingship from David. They sit on the throne of David. The reason why they're king is because God made this promise to David. God is blessing David's descendants, not for them per se, but for David. So sitting on the throne of David means you could not possibly be greater than David because you get your royal kingship from David. You are reigning in the place of David to honor David because God wanted to honor David. So if the Messiah was a mere biological descendant of David who became the king of Israel, he would not be greater than David because his kingship would come from David. He would be reigning on the throne of David in the place of David to the honor of David because God wanted to honor David. So even the Messiah would not be greater than David if he was a mere biological descendant of his. But if he was something more, then maybe he could be greater. That is what Jesus is probably trying to highlight here. If the Messiah is a mere human descendant of David, he wouldn't be greater than him because he would get his majesty from David, from the promise God made with David. But if he was something more than just a human descendant of his, then perhaps he could be called his Lord. This is not to say that he wouldn't be a human descendant of his, or that he wouldn't be a son of David, but that he must be something more than that as well. This mystery is perfectly revealed in the Christian worldview in the person of Jesus. In Revelation 22, verse 16, it says this: I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. Jesus says he is both the root and the descendant of David. Notice these are on two opposite sides of the spectrum. The root is something that a plant gets its life from. A descendant is someone who comes from someone else. So Jesus is saying he is both the source of life for David as well as a descendant of David. This makes perfect sense in the Christian worldview. God incarnate through the seed of David is both the source of life for David as God, as well as the son of David by becoming incarnate through the Blessed Virgin Mary, an actual physical descendant of David. So hopefully that helps you better understand why David would never call the Messiah his Lord if he was only a human descendant of his. But if he's God incarnate, as we understand in the Christian worldview, then it makes perfect sense. Now there's another way that we could perhaps understand the argument that Jesus is making here, and this could work either in addition to the first argument or as a separate argument altogether. The focus in this case would not be so much what David calls the Messiah, but the fact that he speaks about the Messiah as a present reality, as though the Messiah is someone who already exists in his day. Keep in mind, David lived about 1,000 years before this conversation of Jesus took place. If David speaks of the Messiah as a person who's already alive in the lifetime of David, then it makes sense why Jesus would ask the question, in what way is the Messiah the son of David? Because they would have known that at that point, none of the living descendants of David actually were the Messiah. So if the Messiah is already alive in the lifetime of David, and the Messiah is the son of David, and yet none of the biological children of David are actually the Messiah, then in what way is the Messiah the son of David? Again, the point would not be to reject the idea that the Messiah would be a biological descendant of David, but that he must be something more than that as well if he is already alive in the lifetime of David. And once again, this makes perfect sense in the Christian worldview. God becomes incarnate through the seed of David. So David, in his lifetime, 1,000 years prior to the conversation that Jesus is having here, could speak of the person of the Messiah as existing as his Lord already because that person is God, while also referring to him as a son of David, as his descendant, because at a future time, that same person would become incarnate through the Blessed Virgin Mary, a descendant of David, therefore also being a descendant of David, the son of David. So in summary, I think either way you interpret this passage, it shows that Jesus is saying the Messiah must be something more than a mere human descendant of David. Not that he isn't that, but that he must be something more than that as well. So either Jesus is saying the Messiah couldn't be only a human descendant of David because a human descendant alone could never be greater than David because he would get his kingship by sitting on the throne of David, getting his kingship and royalty from David because of the promise that God made to David for David's sake. Therefore, he must actually be something more than a mere biological descendant of his. He must be more than human. Or he's making the point that because David speaks about the Messiah as though he already exists in his lifetime, the Messiah must be something more than a mere biological descendant of his, because in David's lifetime, none of his biological descendants were the Messiah. Therefore, the Messiah must be something more than only a human biological descendant of his. Either way, this mystery is perfectly resolved in the Christian worldview. God becomes incarnate through the seed of David. Therefore, David can both speak of him as his Lord because he is his God. He can also speak of him as existing in his lifetime because God exists in his lifetime. And he can speak of him as being a descendant of his because God will become incarnate through the Virgin Mary, an actual biological descendant of David. Therefore, God, as the Messiah, would become a son of David. I know I'm not the perfect teacher, so hopefully I didn't confuse you guys and this video helps you better understand why Jesus would cite Psalm 110 to hint at the deity of the Messiah. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And as always, learn these arguments well. And once you understand what the argument is and what it isn't, share it with those who are willing to listen. And have a wonderful day, and may God bless you.